This is for you, my shining light. May it make your journey a little happier." Nobody in Duskhollow had expected the night to last more than the usual 8 hours or so. That was, generally speaking, the agreed-upon arrangement. Darkness came, darkness left. The roosters made their opinions known at an unreasonable hour, and life continued. It was a simple system, elegant in its minimalism, and it had worked reliably for several hundred years. Then one Thursday, and it is worth noting that nothing good has ever begun on a Thursday, the sun simply didn't come back. It had set like normal, dipping behind the Greymount Hills in the west with its customary smear of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that made painters weep and farmers mutter something about the next day's weather. The village of Duskhollow had gone to bed. The dogs had gone to sleep on their respective hearths. The baker, Osric Plum, had set his dough to rise. Everything was exactly as it should have been. And then the sun, apparently, got distracted. By the 30th hour of darkness, people had begun to notice. By the 50th, they had moved past noticing and into the more active phases of concern. By the 72nd hour, 3 full days of uninterrupted night, the village council had held 4 emergency meetings, argued themselves into exhaustion, written 3 petitions to the regional governor, who had not responded, presumably because the regional governor was also in the dark, both literally and figuratively, and consumed an alarming quantity of the communal wine reserve. The stars, at least, were spectacular. That was something. Though it had stopped being something anyone found comforting around hour 48. "Read about this," announced Elder Cratch, who was 83 and had the self-satisfied air of a man who had been waiting his entire life for something apocalyptic to validate his extensive reading habits. "In the old texts, the Nevernight, it's a curse." "What kind of curse?" asked Marta the tanner, who was practical above all things and wanted specifics. "The bad kind," said Cratch, which was not particularly helpful. The monsters had arrived on the second night. Or, more precisely, they'd simply materialized out of the extended darkness, as though the dark had grown bored of being empty and decided to fill itself with something entertaining. There were creatures that moved at the edge of every torchlight, tall, angular things with too many joints, and low creeping shapes that breathed in patterns no natural animal had ever attempted, and one particularly memorable entity that appeared to be made entirely of tangled antlers and spite. The remarkable thing was that none of them attacked. They watched. They circled. They stood outside windows in what could only be described as a menacing loitering posture. They made sounds that were technically noises, and yet somehow communicated nothing so much as bored anticipation, the way an audience shuffles before the main act arrives. Elder Cratch found this more unsettling than a direct attack would have been. "They're waiting," he said, several times to anyone who would listen. No one found this reassuring. Cratch said it anyway. Marta the tanner made the pragmatic observation that if the creatures were going to attack, they would presumably have done so already, which was practical if not entirely comforting. The innkeeper, Bavard, proposed that the creatures might simply be confused, having taken a wrong turn somewhere in the supernatural dark, and would move along eventually like lost travelers consulting the wrong map. The blacksmith said nothing at all, but was observed sharpening every tool in his possession to an unprecedented degree, which was at least productive even if it addressed the wrong problem entirely. The children of Duskhollow, it must be said, were holding up considerably better than the adults. This is generally true of children in extraordinary circumstances, partly because they have less experience with the ordinary against which to measure the extraordinary's wrongness, and partly because children have a higher baseline tolerance for things that make no sense. A world that doesn't make sense is one children recognize immediately. They've been in it their whole lives. Pip Holloway had not been consulted about any of this, which was, she felt, a significant oversight. She was 9 years old, which meant that the adults of Duskhollow had assigned her to the category of children, a category that came with certain disadvantages. Mandatory bedtimes, currently irrelevant, but in principle insulting, being told to go inside during council meetings, and having her opinions solicited exactly never. The adults were very busy being frightened in their adult way, which involved a great deal of loud discussion and very little actual investigation. The council's fourth emergency meeting had lasted 6 hours. In that time they had proposed a bonfire visible from space to attract the sun's attention, vetoed on practical grounds, a petition to the nearest city agreed, and then immediately forgotten. A rationing system for candles argued over for 2 hours before anyone noticed they had quite a lot of candles, actually, and a formal resolution declaring the darkness unacceptable and ordering it to cease. The darkness had received this resolution with characteristic indifference. Pip's mother had spent most of the extended night organizing the pantry, which was her way of managing anxiety, and which had resulted in the most beautifully organized pantry in Duskhallow's history, but had not illuminated any new understanding of the cosmic situation. Pip, by contrast, had been investigating. She had a lantern, a notebook that smelled faintly of cheese because she had once stored it next to a wheel of Gouda. This was not relevant to the current crisis, but felt worth mentioning. And the particular brand of fearlessness that belongs exclusively to 9-year-olds who have not yet accumulated sufficient life experience to understand what the large angular creatures with 17 joints are actually capable of. On what she calculated was the fourth night, though night had become a somewhat meaningless term at this point, a bit like calling a flood some water. Pip slipped out through the gap in the garden fence that her mother had been meaning to fix for 3 years and had now, apparently, more pressing concerns about. The village was quieter than it should have been. Every house had light burning in its windows, golden and anxious. The creatures were there as they always were, arranged in the middle distance like the world's least welcoming garden statuary. The antler and spite one was near the mill again. Pip had started thinking of it as Gerald, which made it less frightening, though it had not asked to be called Gerald and might have had objections. She walked to the edge of the village, past the well, past the old elm with the swing that someone's grandfather had put up and no one had ever taken down, and stood where the cobbled lane dissolved into the dark field beyond. The darkness out there was different from ordinary dark. Pip had been out in ordinary dark plenty of times. Her mother frequently despaired, entirely too comfortable being out at night, and this was not that. Ordinary dark had texture to it, an inhabited quality, the sense of soil and grass and beetles going about their business. This dark was attentive. It had the quality of held breath. Something was in it. Not the monsters were behind her doing their patient vigil routine. Something else. Something further away, moving closer in a way that wasn't movement so much as a gradual increase in presence, the way a smell arrives before its source. Pip opened her notebook and wrote, "The dark is waiting, something is coming through it. The monsters are waiting for it too." She paused, chewed her pencil, and added, "I don't think it's the sun." She was correct. It was not the sun. Elder Cratch had, in fact, read considerably more about the Nevernight than he had shared with the village council. He was old enough to have developed the old person's talent for strategic information rationing, which is the polite way of saying he told people things only when he judged they were ready to hear them, and not a moment before, regardless of whether the situation urgently demanded it. The full text of the relevant passage, from a crumbling volume called Observations on Extraordinary Meteorological and Supernatural Events, Volume III Revised, read as follows. The Nevernight does not occur without cause. It is not a curse in the conventional sense, but rather a consequence, specifically, the consequence of something very old deciding that it wishes to enter the world from whichever side it currently occupies. The dark is not punishment, it is preparation. A path, if you will, of appropriate ambience. The creatures that attend the Nevernight are not predators but witnesses. They come because something worth witnessing is coming, and creatures of the dark have excellent taste in spectacle. The night will end when what is coming has arrived. What will happen afterward is, the author confesses, not entirely clear from the available sources, though the general implication of the primary texts is that it rather depends on whether one gets out of the way. Cratch had read this passage 17 times. He had dog-eared the page. He had then undog-eared it because dog-earing was barbaric and he was not a barbarian, even in a crisis, and used a proper bookmark instead. He had not told anyone what it said because "something old is coming through and we may need to get out of the way" was not the kind of statement that produced calm, organized responses in a village council. He had observed village councils for 83 years, and he knew their limitations. The Duskhollow Council in particular had once spent 3 meetings arguing about the height of a fence before someone pointed out the fence was on common land and they didn't own it. They were not, collectively, a group well suited to existential preparation. He had also, if he was honest with himself, and at 83 one had either developed honesty with oneself or given up entirely, been somewhat frightened. Not of the creatures. He had lived long enough to understand that most frightening things were frightening because they were unfamiliar, and familiarity was mostly a matter of time. He was frightened, in a way he couldn't quite name, of what it meant that something this old was on the move. Things that old didn't stir without reason, and reasons, in his experience, had consequences. He had, however, been watching Pip Holloway, who had been conducting what he could only describe as an investigation with considerably more rigor than the adults had managed. On the 4th night, he put on his coat, the good one, the dark green wool, because if something ancient was arriving you might as well look respectable, and went to find her. He found her at the field's edge, which was where he had expected to find her. Pip Holloway was, in his estimation, the most reliably sensible person in Duskhollow, and the field's edge was the only sensible place to be if you wanted to understand what was happening. "You felt it too," she said, without turning around. She had heard his cane on the cobbles. "Known about it since the first night," he admitted, settling himself on the old stone fence with the careful negotiation of a man whose knees had complicated opinions about cold weather. "There's a book." "There's always a book," Pip said, not unkindly. She turned to look at him. What did it say? He told her. All of it this time without the strategic rationing. She was 9, but she was also, he had concluded, the only person in Duskhollow who wasn't too frightened to be useful. Pip absorbed this information with the focused expression of someone doing very rapid mental arithmetic. So the dark is like a red carpet for whatever's coming. That is one way to put it. The monsters are like the crowd that gathers when someone important arrives. They're not here for us. They're here to watch it arrive. An adequate summary, yes. The book doesn't say what happens after. It wasn't quite a question. Author described the available sources as inconclusive, which is scholarly language for everyone who witnessed it was too overwhelmed to take good notes. Pip was quiet for a moment. Out in the field, the darkness had deepened further, which ought to have been impossible given that it was already absolute, and yet it had managed. Whatever was moving through it was closer. She could feel it in her teeth, the way you felt thunder before you heard it. "Gerald's moved," she observed. Cratch glanced back at the village. The antler creature had indeed repositioned itself near the field's edge, perhaps 20 feet from where they sat. It was very large. It made no sound. Its many antlers caught the starlight and did something complicated with it. "You named it Gerald," Cratch said. "It helps." "Yes," he conceded. "I suppose it does." Pip looked at Gerald for a long moment with the assessing expression she used when she was deciding whether something was worth being afraid of. Gerald did not look back precisely, because it was unclear whether it had eyes in any conventional sense. But there was an orientation to it, a quality of awareness that pointed in their direction, and Pip had the distinct impression that being noticed by Gerald was not the same as being regarded as dinner. It was more like being noticed by someone very old and very tired who had found, unexpectedly, that the presence of a small determined child was mildly interesting. "I think it knows we're here," she said. "Most certainly," said Cratch. "Does it mind?" Cratch considered this seriously, which was one of the things Pip appreciated about him. He did not dismiss questions from children simply because they came from children. "I don't believe so. I think we are, at worst, an irrelevance, at best a curiosity." He paused. "The latter is the more interesting possibility." Pip agreed and wrote something in her notebook. Gerald, and there was no taking it back now. The name had attached, turned toward the field with all the solemn attention of a creature who had been waiting a very long time and could feel the waiting nearing its end. The other monsters, the joint-heavy ones and the low-creeping ones and the ones that had no business having the number of eyes they had, were gathering too, spreading along the field's edge in both directions, a long dark gallery of witnesses. They did not speak if they spoke. They did not touch each other or acknowledge each other, the way people who have gathered for the same purpose sometimes don't need to, the purpose itself being all the conversation required. "They are excited," Pip said. Said Cratch. "Yes, I believe they are." The arrival, finally, what came through the dark was not what Pip had been imagining, and she had been imagining quite a lot of things because she had a very good imagination and had been given 4 nights of uninterrupted darkness to deploy it. She had imagined a great winged shape. She had imagined something eyeless and enormous. She had imagined a walking wound in the world, or something made of cold, or something that was simply darkness given intention and appetite. She had read enough of the books her mother kept on the high shelf to have a robust library of apocalyptic imagery to draw from. What actually arrived was light. Not sunlight, not yet, but something older than sunlight, the kind of light that existed before anyone had decided what light was for. It came slowly across the field, moving through the dark the way roots move through soil, with patient, unstoppable certainty. It had no particular shape, or rather it had every shape briefly, as though it was trying each one on and finding them all slightly ill-fitting. The creatures along the field's edge went very still, not frightened still, reverent still. The kind of stillness that happens in a concert hall when the first note lands perfectly, and everyone in the audience holds their breath because the beauty of it doesn't leave room for anything else. "Oh," said Pip, very quietly. It was the only word that fit. Cratch, who had 83 years of words in him and had spent most of his life deploying them with considerable confidence, said nothing at all. He gripped his cane and watched. The light moved through the field and entered the village, not like an invader, not like a flood, but like something returning to a place it had been before and was pleased to find again. It moved through the streets gently, illuminating the cobbles, touching the door frames, pooling in the well. The dogs, which had been huddled inside for 4 days, padded to the windows and watched it pass with the dignified curiosity of animals who have decided that a thing doesn't smell dangerous and can therefore be observed without embarrassment. It passed through the walls of houses without disturbing them, which was the kind of thing that should have been frightening and instead felt, somehow, like courtesy, like a guest who takes off their muddy boots at the door. The sleeping children in their beds, the ones whose parents had managed to get them to sleep despite everything, mostly through exhaustion, shifted and sighed without waking, their faces smoothing into the particular piece of people who, on some level beneath dreaming, recognize something they have always known. Marta the tanner, who had been awake and keeping watch from her upstairs window with a fire poker she had no particular plan for, set the poker down. She didn't decide to. Her hands simply put it aside, the way hands do when they understand before the brain does that there is nothing to defend against. Osric Plum, the baker, opened his front door, took one look, and started crying in the specific way of a man who has no idea why he's crying, but feels absolutely certain that it's the correct response. It was. When the light reached the center of the village, where the old stone circle sat that no one quite knew the original purpose of but which the children used as a base in their games, it paused. Not stopped, paused. The distinction was important. Stopped implied it was finished. Paused implied it was thinking. Then it rose. Slowly and then faster upward, spreading outward as it went, thinning from the ancient bone-white light into something warmer and more familiar, something the color of winter mornings when the sky goes pink before gold, and then, finally, with a kind of exhale that the whole world seemed to breathe, blue. The sun came up. It was not a dramatic sunrise. It did not burst magnificently over the horizon. It arrived quietly, with the slight sheepishness of something that knows it was gone longer than agreed and is trying not to make a bigger deal of it than necessary. The sky went gray, then pale, then the ordinary blue of an ordinary morning. A rooster, specifically Hendrax Bolt's rooster, which had always been exceptionally loud and had a somewhat inflated sense of its own importance to the process of mourning, crowed with tremendous self-satisfaction, as though it had been personally responsible for all of this. The creatures were gone by full sunrise. Not fled, not driven away, simply gone. The way guests leave when the party is over, when they've seen what they came to see and are satisfied. Gerald went with them, though Pip thought she saw a particular arrangement of shadows near the old elm that suggested Gerald had loitered briefly before going. The way certain guests hover near the door saying their goodbyes for an unnecessary amount of time. She hoped it had been worth the trip. Duskhollow took approximately half a day to fully process what had happened, which was actually quite quick by the standards of small village collective psychology. By noon, the baker had produced an enormous quantity of bread to celebrate, which was his solution to most situations. By mid-afternoon, the village council had convened an emergency meeting to discuss whether the stone circle should be fenced off, or alternatively, cleaned up a bit and perhaps given a sign. Elder Cratch attended this meeting in his good coat, said very little, and spent most of it looking out the window with the expression of a man who has understood something that is not transferable by explanation alone. Several people came to Pip with questions, which she found gratifying in the abstract and maddening in the specific, because the questions were almost entirely, what was it? And is it coming back? And should we be worried? Rather than the more interesting questions. Such as what did it want? And why here? And what are the other 14 volumes about? The adults of Duskhollow, she was discovering, had a talent for asking the questions with the shortest possible answers. It was something old passing through, she told them patiently several times. The monsters were watching it, not us. No, I don't know if it's coming back. Possibly. I'd recommend remaining alert and keeping a notebook. This last piece of advice was received with the polite incomprehension it deserved, which was fine. Pip had not yet decided to share her findings broadly. She was still in the phase of organizing them. Good natural history required patience before publication. She had read that somewhere, probably in one of the high-shelf books. Elder Cratch attended the meeting. He did not mention the book. Pip wrote up her observations in the cheese-scented notebook in a neat and thorough manner that would have impressed any archivist. She described the quality of the dark, and the creatures, and the light, and the way the light had moved, and the sunrise at the end. She included a small sketch of Gerald, which was not very good from an artistic standpoint, but captured something essential about the general posture of a creature made of antlers and spite. At the bottom of the page, after a thoughtful pause, she wrote, "I don't think it was a curse. I think the old books were wrong about what it was. It was more like something very old needing to cross the world and the dark being the only road it could use. And when something that old crosses the world, things come to watch, because you don't see that very often and you might not again for a long time." She paused again, chewed her pencil again, and added, "Next time I want to ask it something. If there is a next time. I think there might be." Cratch, whom she showed this to because he was the only adult who had been there and therefore the only one whose opinion on the matter was worth soliciting, read it twice. Then he reached into his coat pocket, produced the book Observations on Extraordinary Meteorological and Supernatural Events, Volume III Revised, and set it on the table between them. "You should probably have this," he said. "I'll be 84 next month. My eyesight is not improving, and I suspect the volumes that come after this one may be relevant." Pip looked at the book, then at Cratch, then at the book again. "There are more volumes, 14, he said, "that I know of." Pip's eyes went wide in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular hunger of someone who has just realized that the thing they were born to do has revealed itself at last. She put her hand on the cover of the book. It was warm. Not frighteningly warm. Not supernaturally, ominously warm. Just warm, the way things sometimes are when they've been carried close to someone for a long time and have absorbed a little of their warmth in return. The warmth of a thing that has been read and marked and thought about by someone who cared for it. "Thank you," she said. "Thank me by taking better notes than the previous authors," said Cratch, who stood up with some difficulty and the assistance of his cane. "Their sourcing was atrocious." 3 weeks later the sun rose and set exactly as it was supposed to for the following 3 weeks, which the residents of Duskhollow found actively wonderful in a way they never had before. It turns out that an uninterrupted run of normal sunrises is intensely moving when you've recently experienced the alternative. Osric Plum cried at 3 of them. He had decided this was acceptable. The stone circle had been cleaned up, though the question of signage remained unresolved because the council couldn't agree on what the sign should say. Current proposed texts included: Ancient Site, Do Not Disturb, Do Not Stand Here If Something is Happening, and Elder Cratch's preferred option, Of Interest to Those Who Keep Their Eyes Open, which everyone agreed was too cryptic but which no one could quite bring themselves to veto. Pip had read through Volume III twice and begun Volume IV, which was subtitled Further Observations, including several which the author admits he should have made the first time. She had started a fresh notebook, unscented, for her own observations, which she had titled on the first page, with the pragmatic confidence of someone who intends to fill many such volumes. Observations on Extraordinary Events by Philippa Holloway, age 9. Volume I. On the third page she had written a short entry: The dark is not always an absence of light. Sometimes it is a road that old things use. The monsters that come with it are not enemies, they are enthusiasts. This is a meaningful distinction. If the dark comes again, do not hide. Watch. Ask questions. Bring a good notebook. She thought about Gerald sometimes, when the night was very still and she stood at the field's edge looking out at the ordinary dark beyond the village's lights. Once, on a night about 2 weeks after the Nevernight had ended, she was almost certain she saw something shift in the shadows near the old elm, a particular arrangement of angles, something that might have been antlers catching the starlight. She raised her hand. The shadow, if it was a shadow, did not move. But the night felt for just a moment like an exhale, like the long-held breath of something very old and very patient, amused in the way that creatures are amused when someone small and determined looks directly at them and refuses to look away. Pip smiled and went home and wrote it all down. The sun rose the next morning, punctual as promised. Everyone agreed this was satisfactory. Even the rooster, though he would never admit he'd been worried. Thanks for listening until the end. Please like and subscribe.